Joining me now to discuss these top stories in the U.S. today is Dr. Carrie Odermann. She's a global affairs expert. Let's look inside Charlie Kirk's memorial service amidst tightened security and what his life reflects in American politics, plus the White House TikTok outline. Good to have you this weekend, Dr. Carrie. Now, how has youth involvement in American politics, such as the activism by Charlie Kirk, influenced national debates and policy decisions?
Well, it's activated a big shift. If you look at the Democratic Party, there are lawmakers that are dying in office because they're not making room for younger representatives of the party. This wasn't quite as evident in the Republican Party, but Charlie Kirk's organization and other liberal organizations like March for Our Lives reframed the policy debate and forced topics to be discussed, whether it be freedom of speech, which Kirk talked about a lot, or gun control laws, like more liberal young people's groups talked about. It did change the dynamic of politics in the United States, and social media had a lot to do with this.
Now, what does the intense security and public concern surrounding high-profile political events like this memorial reveal about the challenges of, polarization and public trust in the United States?
I'm not going to downplay the polarization of U.S. society, but we need to look at the simple facts. This event being held in Arizona is expected to have 100,000 people attending it. You have the president and the vice president of the United States there, along with other prominent politicians. And Arizona is a state with one of the most liberal gun laws in the nation. Anyone over the age of 21 can have a gun, can purchase it without a permit. There is no limit on magazine size there, which means that you have guns that can shoot a lot of bullets, put simply. And in this context alone, it's no surprise that there would be a lot of security at this event. Now, on top of these factors, the political prominence, the gun laws in Arizona, then you add the polarity in the United States and the tension to that. It only makes sense that they're being very, very careful today.
That leads me to this question. In what ways have the rise of digital platforms and social media shaped the effectiveness, the risks, the influence of political activism seen in Charlie Kirk's career?
Well, social media was responsible for him being able to reach as many people as he did. In early September 2025, shortly before he died, he was able to reach 30 million people on different platforms at any given time on any day of the week. That is a huge amount of political power and influence, and also a leveraging instrument to be able to raise funds, which are very, very important when it comes to campaigning. And this is a new form of candidate, if you will. This is a digital first politics where actually being an influencer and having a social media following is more important. And what happens is, rather than having a concentrated group of people in one area that supports you and it branches out, you have a fragmented following across a wide swath of social media. And then these people come together and they create an identity through this commonality. There hasn't been a lot of studies about the effects of this yet, but there's a lot of similarities between this politics first, digital first politics way of influencing the political discourse and something like astroturfing, which is the faking of a grassroots movement. You can fake candidates. And we saw this in Romania in early 2025, when basically a political outsider jumped ahead in the polls and had more followers on TikTok than even eligible voters in his country. And that vote then for the presidency of Romania was canceled because it did not seem right. And the investigation proved that there was outside influence involved.
Now let's move to the area. Charlie Kirk was very, very vocal activist. Now, Talking about free speech, how do you think Charlie Kirk's advocacy for free speech on college campuses will continue to shape the debate around free speech in the United States after his death?
It was seen that in the United States, campuses were home to liberal ideas and people with more conservative thoughts were being shut out. And Kirk speaking about freedom of speech was a way where he was injecting sometimes rhetoric, conservative beliefs, but also things that were defined as hate speech in saying that these things should be allowed. And hate speech is allowed in the United States. This opens up a lot of questions about what should be allowed and what should not be allowed in the United States, and how social media should be regulated, and also civil liberties in general.
Right. Now, in the light of his passing, how can, public figures, politicians and the like, or influencers balance the right of free speech with the need for responsible communication, especially in today's divisive online environment? Plus, I want you to answer that with your thoughts on the balance between protecting free speech and preventing harm on offense, considering Kirk's views and legacy.
I don't think a lot of social media influencers see it as their job to balance anything. And you have to understand that in the United States, there are rules that protect hate speech. And in addition to that, there's a 1996 law. It's about what can be said on the internet. And this law protects platforms from getting in trouble when people use their platforms to spread falsehoods. And this law has not been overturned. So what we have in the United States is really the perfect case study for being able to say what you want, how you want it, and not really having any immediate consequences. And now with this shift that freedom of speech is so important that people are saying the quiet part out loud because it's their opinion, they're forgetting that people's rights stop when they begin to infringe on other people's rights, which was always a common assumption in the United States. So I don't see a lot of motivation for people that have large followings actually to balance that, and I don't see them acknowledging responsibility. There are programs. I'm thinking of the Aspen Institute in Germany, which has a program that's trying to train and teach people, influencers, that they do have a responsibility. And some of these pilot projects are happening in Europe, but in the United States, I'm not aware of anyone that has a large following also being given the burden of not sharing misinformation or disinformation.
So now I'm still going to dwell on this because it's quite important, the issue of free speech. So do you also think as an expert, that free speech is being weaponized to spread harmful, content? Is that valid? Is that a valid school of thought, or is it an overreaction? Coupled with the fact that Trump is going to speak at this particular memorial that Americans are gathered for, and J.D. Vance and the likes that you mentioned from the start. What example, when things like this happen, you sense that leaders should be more accountable to see how they can correct the notion of a lot of Americans, over 100,000 will be attending. How can they fine-tune, Americans' thoughts and beliefs and conspiracies to see that people can debate, people can argue, but then still have a sense of responsibility?
There's not a lot of leading by example from the Trump administration. His shift to supporting free speech, and we saw this in January as Meta's, Facebook's owner, Meta, has now taken off any type of third-party control over what's being said. In Trump's first term, the Washington Post tracked that 30,000 times he shared disinformation or misinformation, and he was not held accountable for that. And he will continue to share his version of reality, and there'll continue to be people that believe everything he says. And the only thing that can be done to prevent this is to educate people about the sources they receive their information on. And I'm saying information, not content, because we're all ingesting content nonstop. But the idea that there should be a way to know where to get information, not just content, is something that needs to be explored much further, especially when over 90% of young people and about 70% of people over the age of 30 are getting all of their news from social media, in the palm of their hand.
Right. Now, I would move you, Dr. Kari, quickly to talk about the TikTok issue, where the White House is outlining, was announced that the U.S. companies will now control TikTok's algorithm. There's been this bipartisan consensus that there's a national security problem with TikTok. Do you think that the Chinese government has manipulated TikTok in some way for the U.S. to have, raised this alarm?
This all ties into also the Charlie Kirk issue, because we're looking at issues where there's a lot of divisiveness in the United States. But the TikTok ban is one of the very few bipartisan issues where lawmakers agree that there is a danger of some sort. You also have to consider that TikTok in the form that we know it in the United States, Africa, and Europe is not allowed in China. Chinese children are not allowed to access TikTok. TikTok and its algorithm is a highly addictive setup, and it is also something that's not completely understood. I thought it was very, very interesting that President Trump was talking about controlling the algorithm, because this entire TikTok debate in the United States had much less to do with consumer privacy and more to do with control of the information that people were getting over TikTok. By adjusting these algorithms, you can control what kind of information people receive, you can strengthen confirmation bias, and you can influence them heavily. So I have been watching the choice of words in the United States when they were talking about this legislation, and it was never really about data protection. It was about information control. And if you think back to President Trump's inauguration, representatives from Google, Amazon, Meta were in the front row, and information and the control of social media platforms is going to be vital in the future for maintaining political control.
That's interesting. So President Trump's stance on TikTok or social media has evolved, for lack of a better word. I'm looking for that's more like a technical term now. How and why do you think that has happened?
I think it has happened because it's been recognized how these social media platforms can influence the public. And it is about, like I said before, power and control. And it's about framing narratives and being able to show your side of the story, or controlling which part of the story is shared. I don't know if you know this or not, but I actively advise governments on their activities on TikTok, because many governments around the world and ministries had avoided being on this platform on social media, and they did not want to have the data protection issues. And what happened as a result is that vacuum that they would have taken up, that space they would have taken up by providing information, was filled by other groups. And oftentimes they were nefarious groups. In Europe, we saw a huge rise in far-right political activists active on TikTok. And it took years for other parts of the political spectrum to catch up and be able to reach a sector of the population that was only getting their information there. So TikTok is going to remain very important. It's important that people are on the app, but I want you to know, as someone that is a hands-on practitioner, there are changes in the algorithm that affect what kind of information is pushed out. And as a creator, you get a sense for that. And it often ties into political decisions in the United States when these changes happen with the algorithm.
Right. In just a sentence, please, with growing debate around TikTok's safety, privacy, and data protection from what you've said, what are the most urgent risks and challenges policymakers and users should be aware of? And how might recent U.S. social media regulations impact political influence?
I don't think U.S. social media regulations are going to affect political influence. I think users need to understand how to educate themselves and find trusted sources. I think think tanks and universities and governments need to be on these platforms and not reject them and take up space so people can passively get information from them. And my final thought is the consideration at some point we may be looking at in a government, in an emergency, in some type of natural disaster, a government taking over someone's social media account to be able to reach people with important information. And that's something that I'm looking at that's going to be developing.
Wow. Interesting. Thank you so much for your point of view on the headlines today. Dr. Kari joined us from Cairo, Egypt to talk about the top stories on Arise America.